Finally, the nuisance is gone. From today, we're living with my parents at my house.
Matthew's words hung in the air as I stood dumbfounded in front of our demolished family home, right after my parents had passed away.
What are you talking about?
Have you lost your mind too? Hurry up and bring the inheritance over to my place. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at his words. I see. So that's what this was about. What? Why are you laughing?
You guys don't know?
Know what? As I laughed, Matthew and the in-laws looked at me quizzically. It was then that I decided to tell them the truth. My name is Madison. I was born the eldest daughter in a family of ordinary full-time working parents. I have one older brother. A perfectly normal family. At 29, I married my husband Matthew, and we had 2 children. Juggling work and child-rearing, before I knew it, I was already 55. Our son, Kenneth, and our daughter, Amelia, had grown up and become respectable members of society. They were both living on their own, struggling with their new careers. Now it was time for Matthew and me to enjoy some peace. It was a plain life, but a happy one. I had always thought we would continue to age together like this. But then, one winter day, everything changed. Dad was in a traffic accident and passed away suddenly. He was only 72 at the time. Our family was engulfed in sorrow, especially since Dad had been so healthy. Mom was particularly devastated, hardly able to eat.
Mom, I know you're sad, but you have to eat.
I kept telling Mom this over and over.
I know, but I just don't have an appetite. It feels like there's a lump in my chest.
My brother and I thought Mom was just going through a rough emotional patch, so we watched her for a while. But then, Mom's weight started to drop rapidly in just half a month. Worried, I decided to take her to the hospital.
What? Cancer?
I was stunned when the doctor diagnosed Mom with cancer. It was advanced and inoperable, and she only had about a year left. I hadn't been able to do enough for my parents yet. Just when I thought we had only lost Dad, now Mom was going through this. I was even more devastated than when Dad passed away. But there was no time to stay sad forever. My brother lived far away and couldn't be relied upon. So, it was up to me to help Mom. I immediately told Matthew that I wanted to live with Mom. I couldn't leave Mom alone, both emotionally and physically, in her illness. But Matthew's reaction was not what I expected.
What? We just finished the funeral, and now I have to deal with your parents again?
Matthew said this with a sigh, sounding annoyed.
You don't have to say it like that. Isn't it enough to just drive her to and from the hospital? Why do we have to live together? I think she'll feel lonely. If it's not okay, maybe I can live at my parents' house for a while?
I suggested. Then, Matthew said indignantly.
What? And who's going to take care of my meals then? I'll come over to cook, of course. What about cleaning? Laundry? Who's going to do all that?
I was rendered speechless. I intended to do what I could, but I couldn't handle everything as usual. His pointed remarks hurt. I couldn't argue back if someone said that my desire to help and nurse Mom was just my selfishness. I knew Mom would probably hesitate and insist that everything should stay the same. But I desperately wanted to show my filial piety.
Fine, but I'm not helping with anything, understand?
Matthew grudgingly said this to me, who was silent. Although his attitude was arrogant, he had ultimately given in.
I'm sorry, and thank you.
Even though I thought he was being quite terrible, he had agreed to my request. I held back my desire to retort and expressed my gratitude. Despite the disagreement, Matthew and I started living with Mom at my parents' home. We had been living in company housing provided by Matthew's company. Matthew was an only child. Thomas had expressed a desire to live together, so there were no plans to buy a home, and eventually, we were supposed to live in the in-laws' house. While he was still working, the company housing was more convenient for commuting, and the rent was only about $300 a month, not a significant burden. However, Moving to my parents' house eliminated that expense, and the house was more spacious. I think living together wasn't all downsides for Matthew. As he had declared, Matthew didn't help with anything, but I was happy to be able to live with Mom. Mom seemed energetic, but she often felt weak and spent a lot of time lying down during the day. I prepare meals for Mom and make sure she eats them. I also arrange her medication. Doing all this alone would have been impossible for Mom.
I'm sorry, Madison.
Thank you.
It's a big help to have you here. I should thank Matthew too.
Mom expressed her gratitude to us many times. I hadn't told her about the harsh words Matthew had said when we decided to live together, so she seemed grateful to him as well. One evening, after Mom had gone to bed and Matthew had come home, I served him dinner and said,
"About Mom's treatment."
But Matthew glared at me and said,
"Don't tell me about it. I don't want to hear it. I told you I'm not helping."
And refused to listen. I too wanted to vent or seek advice from someone. All I wanted was for Matthew to just listen. Matthew's attitude didn't change, not after a month, nor after 2. He complained about living with my mother, acting as if he was doing a great favor by agreeing to it. His behavior became increasingly arrogant and dismissive day by day. But I couldn't really say anything in response. The stress of worrying about Mom and being considerate of Matthew was building up. Around the time when a year had passed since Mom's terminal diagnosis, her health rapidly deteriorated, and she was hospitalized. 3 days later, she passed away. Despite being mentally prepared, I was deeply saddened. My brother's family and my children rushed to support me, but in times like these, you really want your spouse by your side. However, Matthew just laughed and chatted with the in-laws in a corner, not helping with the funeral at all. My brother took on the role of the chief mourner, and we somehow managed to prepare for the funeral. But Matthew sat at the very back of the relative seats when he should be seated at the bereaved family seats.
"Matthew, I'd like you to sit in the bereaved family seats."
When I said this, Matthew replied,
"No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative after all. But you are my husband."
Then Addison, who was listening to our conversation, chimed in.
"He may be your husband, but he's not your mom's son, right?"
"Matthew is my son, so he's an outsider."
"That's right. We're Matthew's only parents. You can sit in the bereaved family seats, Madison."
Hearing the in-laws say this, I fell silent. While traditions may vary by region, in our area, it's customary for sons-in-law to sit in the bereaved family seats. As expected, when relatives noticed Matthew wasn't in the bereaved family seats, I overheard whispers like,
"Did they get divorced?"
It was embarrassing, and while those gossiping were at fault too, it would have been resolved if Matthew had just sat there. I felt a bit resentful that Matthew wasn't by my side, but we managed to give Mom a proper send-off. After the funeral, we returned home with my brother's family, my children, Matthew, and the in-laws.
"Thomas, Addison, thank you for coming during this busy time."
I expressed my gratitude to the in-laws and served them coffee. Then, they said, laughing, "Really though?
First your father passed away, and now your mother. It's been quite costly for us too. But at least it's over now."
I was stunned by their words. How could they say such things? I couldn't believe what they were saying. I forced a smile and left the room, trying my best to keep my composure. Then, as I walked away, I could hear the conversation between the in-laws and Matthew behind me.
"Matthew, it must have been hard for you, living with someone else's family." "Yeah, Madison's stubbornness was quite a challenge. You shouldn't always give in to your wife. It's okay to say no in a marriage."
I clenched my fist. Their voices, chatting and laughing, filled me with anger and frustration, but this wasn't new. The in-laws had always been insensitive and rude. When I married Matthew,
"Couldn't you have found someone more attractive?" "I worry about the grandkids' looks,"
Addison declared.
"They say beauty bores you after 3 days. With Madison, that's unlikely to happen,"
he said. Matthew laughed at these rude comments. It was a pattern with this family. Something in me snapped. I realized that neither the in-laws nor Matthew had ever said a word of comfort to me, not during Dad's funeral, nor after Mom passed. Instead, they mocked me. Matthew's behavior and attitude as a person started to raise questions in my mind. I thought I had been too considerate towards Matthew when all I wanted was to do something for Mom. If Matthew had been supportive towards me, it would be one thing. But he wasn't, and there was absolutely no reason for me to feel so guilty towards him. My growing anger was overshadowed by the ongoing laughter and chit-chat of the in-laws and Matthew in the background. If my brother's family or the kids had overheard them, they would have been upset, but luckily, they were all in the kitchen. I was the only one who heard their conversation since I was in a different room, which was a relief. As I was contemplating all this, Addison's voice once again reached my ears.
Madison.
Yes? I turned to respond.
Can I take this?
Addison was holding Mom's handbag. I was perplexed, not understanding what was meant by that. Addison responded to me, saying,
Your mom can't use it anymore, right? Matthew said it's okay to take it.
Addison was examining the bag as if appraising it. It was so disrespectful, especially right after the funeral. I took the bag away. No, you can't.
Huh?
Her expression changed, showing not just anger about having the bag taken away, but also that I, her daughter-in-law, had dared to stand up to her. Despite the intensity of her expression, I stood my ground and responded with equal determination.
We're not ready to go through Mom's belongings yet. We'll divide her things among family members later.
Addison was furious.
What? Are you saying I'm an outsider? Didn't you just say at the funeral that even Matthew was an outsider? How does that make you family?
I couldn't help but retort. Hearing my words, Matthew and Thomas also turned red.
What are you saying? Apologize to Mom. How rude for a wife to say such things.
Hearing the commotion, everyone else came from the other room.
After all the effort we put in, attending the funeral and cremation, to be called an outsider. Let's go, Thomas.
Addison yelled at me in front of everyone and left our house. Matthew, too, angrily left with the in-laws.
What happened? Did you really say they were outsiders to Mom?
Everyone, having heard only Addison's words, said that to me. Indeed, if only that part of the conversation was considered, it might sound like I was the one being unreasonable. However, I explained the entire situation to everyone. Not a single person blamed me.
Grandma and Grandpa should have been more considerate. Dad's just the same. They've always been like that.
My kids stood by me, but I couldn't forgive those three. Matthew didn't come home for a while. And I didn't contact him. I felt it wasn't right for me to apologize, and I wasn't ready to forgive. However, I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. One day, as I was pondering this, Matthew came home.
Welcome back.
Seeing his face reignited my anger, but I suppressed it and greeted Matthew. Then, Matthew said,
It's been tough, hasn't it?
His awkward attempt at consolation surprised me.
Take the kids on a trip. It'll be a good change of pace.
He handed me travel vouchers. I was speechless. And tears welled up. Maybe the kids had influenced him. But I was happy he went along with it. I immediately contacted my children to plan the trip.
Dad did?
That's unusual. They were surprised by my suggestion. It seemed to be genuinely from Matthew.
I wonder if Dad feels sorry,
I said, smiling. And so, I gratefully accepted the trip offered by Matthew. I'll be going then.
Sure. Take it easy. Why not stay at the kids' places while you're at it?
Really? I can't be away that long.
It's fine. I'll relax at my parents' house, so don't worry about me.
Matthew said this as he saw me off. Amelia was happy to have me visit, so before the trip, I went to Amelia's and then Kenneth's place. Since I hadn't been able to visit them while caring for Mom, I helped them a bit with household chores, like preparing some meals for them to freeze.
Mom, you're not really resting, are you? But it's a big help. Thank you.
Both of them were delighted to have my home-cooked meals. This was all thanks to Matthew's suggestion. Then came the long-awaited trip. I spent a relaxing time with my children at our destination. It seemed to heal the fatigue from caregiving and the sorrow of losing my parents. Although I was away for almost a week, both children returned to their homes with bright smiles.
It was fun. We should thank Dad once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while. But I wonder if he's up to something? Amelia said this with a joking tone.
Don't say that. Dad thought about it in his own way.
I laughed along with them. I planned to return home and share all these memories with Matthew, looking forward to a happy life together as a couple. But when I arrived home, I was speechless.
What's going on? Where's the house?
I looked around in disbelief, confirming my location. Despite being in a familiar place, my parents' house was gone. Then, Matthew appeared out of nowhere. The in-laws were behind him. They were wearing smug smiles, while I could only stand there.
Matthew, what's happening?
I asked Matthew, bewildered. Matthew, with a similarly unsettling smile as the in-laws, said,
Finally, the nuisance is gone. Now, it's time to live with my parents at my house. What are you talking about?
I replied calmly to Matthew's arrogant statement. Then, Matthew continued.
Have you lost your mind too? Your family home has been demolished. Hurry up and bring your inheritance to my place. Whatever you inherited is ours now.
I realized then. The reason our house was gone was Matthew's doing, and it was all for the inheritance. Despite having thought about the future on my way home, what a betrayal it was. I was overwhelmed with frustration and sadness. But even if they went to the lengths of demolishing the house, they wouldn't get their way. I wouldn't let them. I burst into laughter at the faces of the three, who were still sporting their smug smiles. My laughter seemed to confuse Thomas and Matthew, leaving them looking bewildered.
What? Why are you laughing? What a weird woman. Has she gone crazy?
Addison looked at me as if I were something bizarre. I faced the three of them and said,
You guys don't know?
Know what? I then told Matthew.
I didn't inherit anything at all. So there's no inheritance.
I started laughing again after saying this. They must have mistakenly thought they would become rich from the inheritance. Their baseless assumptions and actions were so ludicrous, I couldn't stop laughing.
What do you mean? Explain yourself.
Matthew demanded an explanation. But I chose to remain silent. I saw no need to enlighten them.
Before that, let me say this. I won't live with strangers. If you want to live together, do it on your own.
Instead of answering Matthew's question and refusing his initial proposal, Addison erupted in anger.
You helped your own parents with their housework, but you can't help us? You do understand there was a reason for that, right? I agreed to live together, didn't I? I said it wasn't necessary for us to live together. Have you forgotten that you chose to live together just to avoid housework?
Matthew and Addison bit their lips as I countered their arguments.
And demolishing my family home without permission, there are things you just don't do.
I reprimanded the three of them. And then left the place. Behind me, Matthew called out.
Where are you going?
His voice rang out. But I didn't turn back. I needed to find a place to sleep for the night, and I really didn't want to see Matthew's face. I immediately consulted a lawyer. It's not that easy to just demolish a house. The house was still in Mom's name. As I wondered which company had taken on the demolition, an unbelievable truth came to light. Matthew and Thomas had directly demolished the house themselves. Thomas had asked a friend who worked at a demolition company to help and even rented heavy machinery. It was all meticulously planned. Moreover, they had given me the travel vouchers to get rid of me. I felt pathetic for being so easily deceived and was incredibly angry.
Is there any way to punish these three?
I asked the lawyer with tears in my eyes. The lawyer smiled kindly at me.
For demolishing a house in your mother's name without permission, Matthew can be charged with property destruction, and you can claim damages. Let's start there and get Matthew and his parents to properly apologize.
I nodded at the lawyer's words. The lawyer then immediately began the legal process. A few days later, after learning about the situation, an enraged Matthew called me.
What's this legal notice about?
Oh, you received it?
You destroyed an important house, so naturally, you need to compensate. Compensate? We told you we were moving into our family home. We demolished a house nobody was going to live in. Instead of compensation, you should be thanking us. Now, bring whatever inheritance you have and come back home.
Matthew arrogantly retorted.
Thank you for demolishing my house without permission? Don't make me laugh. And as for bringing the inheritance, there's none to bring since I didn't inherit anything.
I shouted back at him over the phone. Matthew remained silent. It seemed he was startled by my raised voice, something unusual for me who rarely shouts. The reason I laughed when the house was demolished was precisely this. I had spent a year living with Mom. It was obvious we would have discussed inheritance. I had said to Mom, I don't need anything. Give it all to my brother. So, my brother inherited everything, including the cash and securities. Instead, he had offered me the house, saying he lived far away and couldn't manage it. If I wasn't going to live there, it could be rented out. And so, I was supposed to inherit the house.
Either you and Thomas restore the family home to its original state, or pay the amount specified in the notice. This amount! I'm being generous by offering a settlement. If you can't pay, I'll file a complaint and sue you.
I spoke firmly.
Sorry. I didn't expect you to be so angry. Of course I'm angry.
Matthew started making excuses. He had thought that if my family home remained, he couldn't live with his parents. Thomas, in particular, had been hoping to live together for a long time. He took a liking to Kenneth and seemed to want to live with him. It was Matthew who refused to live together at that time, citing the difficulty of commuting, but the in-laws seemed to be under the impression that it was I who was against it, unaware of the real reason. So, they thought demolishing my family home and taking the inheritance would force me to move in with them. However, hearing this now didn't make it any more forgivable.
So, please forgive me. I didn't mean any harm. Dad is remorseful too. If you're truly remorseful, then accept the settlement.
I said this and hung up the phone. Matthew kept calling and sending messages, apologizing.
If you're sorry, then just transfer the money quickly.
I pushed Matthew away with these words. I knew the family home couldn't be restored, but demanding compensation was the only way I could process my feelings. Afterward, I stayed at Amelia's house. My brother's family and my children were aware of the situation. Even though my brother must have been angry about the house being demolished without permission.
I won't interfere, but I'll help if you need it. Do what you think is right, Madison,
he said. Everyone condemned Matthew's actions and supported me. A month passed without any payment of the deposit or damages. And there was no contact from Matthew. I couldn't rely on Amelia forever. I wanted to get the money and at least establish a stable living situation. Contrary to my wishes, something unbelievable happened. It was revealed to me through Amelia's casual remark.
This apron looks like Grandma's, doesn't it?
Amelia said this while showing me her mobile phone screen. Upon seeing the screen, I was taken aback. It was a free market app's product page. The apron that Amelia said resembled my mom's was actually a unique one I had made for her.
How can this be? That is Grandma's apron. I made it, so I'm sure of it. What?
Amelia quickly started checking other pages. The seller seemed to have recently registered, with 0 transaction counts and ratings. There were nearly 30 items listed for sale, and to my shock, all of them belonged to Mom. I immediately realized what was happening. It was Matthew's doing. He was the only one who could have taken Mom's belongings after demolishing the house. I called Matthew right away.
What's with that app?
App? Matthew responded with an air of inconvenience. Fuming, I didn't let him play ignorant.
Don't play dumb. You're selling Mom's things, aren't you? Cancel those listings right now.
Then, Matthew seemed to panic.
What? No, it's not me. Who else would do such a thing? I'm coming over to get everything back.
I hung up and immediately headed to the in-laws' house with Amelia.
Where are Mom's belongings?
As soon as we arrived at the in-laws' house, I called out for Matthew. We were met at the entrance.
I don't know anything about it. Dad, tell the truth.
Amelia backed me up, confronting Matthew. He looked troubled. As we were talking, the in-laws noticed our presence and came out.
Oh, Amelia, you're here?
Addison seemed pleased to see Amelia. But Amelia, visibly angry, confronted her.
Grandma, tell Dad to be honest. Honest about what? It seems Dad is selling Grandma's stuff that was left when she passed away.
At Amelia's words, Addison laughed. Matthew, looking troubled, furrowed his brow and repeated.
It's really not me.
Then, Addison said loudly.
Matthew is selling them? That's impossible. But. Because I'm the one selling them.
I felt as if the blood had drained from my face at her words. Matthew must have known. He looked at Addison with an expression that screamed trouble. Even as Amelia stood there in shock, Addison seemed cheerful.
What did you say? It's quite a lot of work, you know? I have to pack things carefully and take good photos for the listings.
Addison talked about the app as if it were an enjoyable hobby, seemingly oblivious to the fact she was selling stolen items. Had to restrain myself from lashing out at her.
Cancel the listings. Those items aren't yours to sell.
Amelia, now red-faced and teary, pleaded with Addison. But Addison looked displeased. What's the big deal?
I've found a fun hobby. I use what I can and sell what I can't for a little pocket money. It's good for preventing dementia. Besides, I'm the only grandma left. Amelia, you want me to stay healthy and live a long life, right?
Addison said this without any hint of remorse. Even as we appealed to her to stop, she showed no signs of regret. If talking won't work, then action is the only option. Amelia, let's go.
But.
It's fine. Let's leave. I practically dragged Amelia out of the house. And went straight to the police station. Although I hadn't intended to report the demolition of the house, theft was a different matter. I explained to the police that Mom's belongings were stolen and being sold. They acted immediately, and the free market app suspended Addison's account. At least now, no more items could be sold. On the way back from the police station, I called Matthew.
I had Addison's account suspended.
You knew about this, right? That makes you complicit.
No, I've filed a report with the police. I expect you to cooperate with the investigation.
Matthew became frantic at my words.
But we're family. Please withdraw it. Family? You still haven't paid for the damage you caused to my house, and I don't see any signs of remorse.
Matthew was troubled by my angry retort. However, I wasn't heartless. Despite everything with the in-laws, there was a history with Matthew that couldn't be ignored. Sighing, I said,
I'll wait for the money, but I won't forgive the theft. Everything must be returned. Also, Thomas looked quite ill. Has he been to the hospital? What? I'm not a monster. Just make sure he gets that message.
I said, and hung up the phone. I saw Thomas for the first time in a while. He barely spoke and looked significantly thinner than just a few months ago. His complexion was beyond pale, almost ashen. It was clear he wasn't healthy. But that family seemed oblivious. Addison focused on selling stolen goods and Matthew only putting on a brave face for me. They lacked basic empathy. The next day, Thomas called me. I expected gratitude but got the opposite.
Why are you treating me like a sick person? Planning to shove me in a hospital to get rid of me? I have to protect Addison and Matthew from you. I won't go to the hospital.
He was scolding me. Here I was, concerned about him, and this was his response.
I apologize if I overstepped. I was just worried. I'm not weak and short-lived like your parents. Don't insult me.
His words irritated me, but a few days later, he apparently felt unwell enough to visit the hospital. The diagnosis was terminal cancer. Matthew, in a panic, called me.
Dad's got terminal cancer. What am I going to do?
But I just snorted in response.
I don't want to hear it. Do you know what he said when I suggested going to the hospital? I'm not weak and short-lived like your parents.
Do as you please.
How can you be so heartless, Madison?
Who's the heartless one?
Did you ever say a kind word to my mom when she was sick? Reflect on your own actions.
I said this and hung up the phone. As expected, Thomas soon passed away. I didn't want to hold negative feelings towards someone who passed away, but I couldn't muster any tears for him, remembering all he had done and said. After his funeral, his will was discovered. The man who insisted he wasn't short-lived had everything meticulously planned.
The house goes to my grandson, Kenneth. The rest of the estate is to be split between my wife and eldest son.
I was surprised to hear Kenneth's name. Thomas had always favored Kenneth and wanted to live with him. Perhaps he hoped Kenneth would live in the house after he was gone. To Kenneth, this might have been an inconvenience.
You should renounce the inheritance.
You don't need that house. I advised Kenneth, but he was happy to receive it. The inheritance tax was a burden, and there seemed to be no benefit for Kenneth. However, he was pleased, so I decided not to interfere further. Kenneth inherited the house as per Thomas's will. Addison seemed pleased and paid the inheritance tax.
He's our heir, after all. It's only natural,
she said. Well, that's not incorrect. I was a bit downcast, feeling like I had lost Kenneth, but then something unbelievable happened.
Come to our place.
I received this message from Matthew and immediately went to the in-laws' house. There, like me once, stood Addison and Matthew, stunned in front of the house. In front of me, on the grounds of the in-laws' house, there was a truck with Matthew's name on it, along with employees. And there, right before my eyes, the in-laws' house was being demolished.
What's happening? It's my house. I can do whatever I want with it, right?
Kenneth, appearing out of nowhere, watched the demolition of the family home with satisfaction.
Kenneth, what are you doing? Stop this right now. Even if I stop them now, it's not like anyone can live here anymore. Kenneth, what have you done?
Addison and Matthew pleaded with Kenneth. But he just laughed.
Have you forgotten what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom? Kenneth. Grandma, did you apologize for what you did to Mom?
Kenneth's smile vanished, replaced by a piercing glare at Addison and Matthew. The two of them sank to their knees. The heavy machinery continued to noisily dismantle the in-laws' house. I finally felt a sense of relief. Later, Matthew finally paid the damages and the security deposit using the inherited assets. It turned out Kenneth had recovered the items Addison stole from Mom, and they were safely returned to me.
Mom, you have me and Amelia.
Don't worry. I shed tears of relief at his words. Addison and Matthew, having lost their home and with no money left, were now back in company housing. Matthew and I left the company housing. And now, returning to it with his mother, they've become the talk of the town. People are wondering what happened. I received such a message from the wife of a colleague of Matthew, who I'm on good terms with. So, I decided to tell her the whole truth, without any deception. The two of them will probably feel awkward from now on, but it's their own responsibility. Furthermore, after Matthew's resignation, the two, having lost their place to live, are now forced to economize in preparation for their new home. Occasionally, I'm considering asking my friends about how the two are faring, just for some conversation. Meanwhile, I continued to stay at Amelia's house, but then Kenneth decided to get married. He plans to build a new home. The land where the in-laws' house stood sold for a good price, which was unexpectedly beneficial.
Mom, come live with us.
Furthermore, Kenneth said that to me. His wife-to-be expressed her warm welcome to the idea, which I found very heartening. Since I couldn't stay with Amelia forever, I gratefully accepted his offer. Determined not to end up like Addison, I look forward to living happily with my new family.